Good morning. How's it going? This is Geography 10, Lecture 6. Waitlist issues, I don't have any new news. I am amazed that there are this many seats available in the lecture hall, given the pleas that I've received by email from people on the wait list. Okay. Today we're going to continue our discussion of Alfred Crosby. I'm going to try to pick up a couple of points that I failed to get to at the end of the last lecture. We were talking about domestication, different ways of understanding what it means to domesticate plants and animals. Where it happened, when it happened, that kind of thing. The last couple of things I want to pick up from last lecture involve possible ways of criticizing Crosby's argument. Then I want to try to explain Pleistocene overkill. This is a rather famous, now widely accepted theory about the interaction of humans when they arrived in the New World, and how they affected what are known as Pleistocene megafauna. Some of those large animals, the mastodons, for example, that we saw in that picture last time. This is an important part of Crosby's argument, and we need to understand it. And then at the end, I want to talk a little bit about the bibliographies. Who has got a syllabus that they could quickly refer to briefly for me and tell me when the bibliographies are due? I'm sorry? The week of March 29th. And I believe are they due in section? Yes. So the week of March 29th, you're going to have to turn in an annotated bibliography, which will represent the research you have done in preparation for writing your research paper. So as part of lecture today, I want to talk about what a bibliography is, why it's important, how to do it, and why it is a part of the process of putting together your research paper for the semester. Okay? Are there any questions before we get started? Okay. So, the readings for today, Crosby chapters 4 and 5. Next Tuesday, I will not be here, and you will watch a movie in lecture, Favela Rising, as I've said, which is about slums in Rio de Janeiro. For a week from today, I'd like you to have read pages 16 to 31 in your atlas, although much of the lecture a week from today will actually continue the discussion of Crosby. But you do need to read those pages from the atlas as well. Okay? When we left off last time on Tuesday, I was talking about a variety of possible objections that might be raised right up front to Crosby's argument, as he had presented it in the opening chapters of his book, right? I talked about environmental determinism and whether this argument might be an instance of environmental determinism or not. I'm going to come back somewhat to that in a moment. We talked about cultural Darwinism, whether this argument essentially justified or naturalized the domination of one culture or set of cultures, namely European, or what became, in his terminology, Neo-European culture, over the peoples of the Neo-Europes, the peoples who were there before the Neo-Europeans arrived. Whether this could be seen as an argument that naturalized that by suggesting that somehow the Neo-Europeans were more fit, and that is therefore why they came to dominate over those who had been there before. And then I didn't quite get around to the argument, is this perhaps a great big tautology? What's a tautology? Anybody know? Nobody knows what a tautology is. Anybody taking logic? Does anybody take logic anymore? Any guesses what a tautology is? Anybody? Yeah. No, it's not an if-then. It's not an argument. It's a certain kind of that kind of argument, perhaps. But that in and of itself is not a tautology. That would just be some kind of inference or deduction. Yeah.
Isn't it like a repetition?
A repetition. I think you're getting at it, but I mean, a tautology in the simplest sense is a circular argument. What's a circular argument? Yeah.
You give one thing, and then A causes B, and then B causes A, and so you circle around.
A causes B, and B causes A, so it's circular in that sense. That would be one type of a circular argument, although that wouldn't necessarily be logically problematic if you had some kind of positive feedback, right, in which A makes B greater, and B in turn makes A greater, which in turn makes B greater again, right? That's not exactly what we're getting at here. If anybody cares to like look tautology up on the web or something and give us a technical definition, that would be fine with me. Yeah.
In logic, a tautology is a formula which is true in every possible interpretation.
A formula which is true in every possible interpretation. That's an interesting way of putting it. That's in logic. Okay. Anybody want to offer a guess as to how you might read Crosby's argument that way? I mean, the idea here is that perhaps the argument doesn't explain anything because perhaps it sort of is self-validating. Or rather, it's circular in the sense of, well, let's think about it in terms of Crosby, right? His argument is about one group of peoples coming to dominate over another group of peoples. And he purports to be offering an explanation of why that happened. But what does it mean to dominate over another group of people? Or over, what does it mean to dominate an area or a region in his argument? It means you're there, and other people aren't there, and you're succeeding in reproducing your society there. What does that consist of by his argument, on one reading anyway? I mean, he seems to be saying that what it means to dominate is to be there and to have the sort of suite of plants and animals and practices and technologies that enable you to dominate, right? You've got the plants and the animals you need to produce your food. You've got an environment in which those foodstuffs can be grown well. You aren't dying of all kinds of diseases. You are flourishing, prospering. Well, if the content of dominating is having these plants and animals and practices that allow you to dominate, and what he's saying is the Europeans had these plants and animals and immune systems and so forth that dominate in these areas, then in a sense all he's doing is saying they're dominating because they're dominating. Right? They're dominant because they're dominant. They succeeded because they define success. Now, I'm not saying that Crosby actually falls victim to this weakness. I'm just raising it as a possibility, something to think about. It's related to the possibility that this might be an environmental determinist argument, and also possibly to the possibility that it might be a cultural Darwinist argument. I'm just pointing out that if he's going to explain domination, domination has to consist of something more than simply the fact of dominating, right? It's got to have some content, some substance that allows you to sort of differentiate between the causes of domination and domination itself, so to speak. Now, it would kind of like be, putting it in its simplest terms, it would seem to say the Europeans are people who figured out how to live really well in certain kind of climates, and therefore they dominate these climates because these are the climates in which they dominate. End of story. And that isn't a very satisfying argument by itself, viewed from a sort of logical perspective. That's all. So let's try to think about the details of this argument a little further. Oh, shoot, there's one more I've got to get into. And that's the category of race. And then I'll come back to why I don't think he actually falls victim to these problems. Now, the next couple slides are in here in part because of Jared Diamond. And that is to say that in previous years when I taught Jared Diamond's book instead of Crosby's book, this was a really important point to try to drive home. How many of you have read Guns, Germs, and Steel? Okay, quite a few of you. The question Diamond sets himself at the beginning of that book is somewhat like the question Crosby sets, right? He says, why is it that some people have got all the wealth and money and power and other people don't? And why does it have certain patterns? And in a way, he's saying, why is it that the white people, whether they're in Europe, North America, Southern South America, Australia, seem to have all the stuff? And elsewhere, there are people, and Diamond sort of drives this point home by saying, he's done a lot of work in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea. He's met a lot of people who are poor. And one of them actually asked him this question, a sort of leader of a tribe, asked him, how come you guys have all the goods? And Diamond's like, well, this is weird. Why is it that these people that I know in these parts of the world, they're every bit as smart as we are? They're every bit as creative and interesting. There's no obvious reason why they should have. And he then goes on to say that he's going to make an argument that will wipe out any claim that somehow this is based in race. His agenda in the book is to somehow get rid of all last traces or remnants of any kind of racial argument about prosperity and the distribution of wealth in the world. And the funny thing about it is that he proceeds to write this 400-page long book, and he can't let go of race, even as he tries to transcend it. He's stuck in racial categories, and in many ways, even as he explicitly says it's not about race, the very fact that he can't stop talking about race seems to suggest that he hasn't himself actually transcended it. So this is still relevant for Crosby, if only because the sort of problematic he's trying to engage is similar, right? Is this argument somehow about the fact that white people were better suited to and came to dominate large parts of the world for reasons that had to do, somehow or another with their culture, their race, their whatever, their sort of essential being as biological organisms rather than something else? So what about race? And I want to quote for you at some length from the report of a blue ribbon task force assembled by the American Anthropological Association a little over a decade ago. And they devoted quite a bit of time, a couple of years, with anthropologists from throughout the discipline. So we're talking about social and cultural anthropologists, also archaeologists, biological anthropologists, people who have studied the evolution of hominids from the earliest times, people with expertise in material culture, genetics, you name it, right? And they were interested, this was the time, roughly, of some public debate in the U.S. about race and academic performance, for example. And they were tasked with the job of assessing what exactly race is with respect to humanity. They said, in the United States, both scholars and the general public have been conditioned to viewing human races as natural and separate divisions within the human species based on visible physical differences. With the vast expansion of scientific knowledge in this century, however, it has become clear that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarcated, biologically distinct groups. So they're saying, in the public perception, race is sort of a natural category, right? And you can actually read race off of, say, a photograph. Diamond includes about 24 pages in the middle of his book where he's got these nice glossy photographs of people from around the world, like headshots of all these people, and it's all about, like, here's Nelson Mandela. He's black. You know, here's a primitive person from Indonesia, you know, dark-skinned. You know, it's like all these people, he's like, this is, on the one hand, it's a sort of exhibit of human diversity. On the other hand, it's very much this kind of thing. Like, you can look at the picture and you can say, that person is black, that person is Asian, that person is white, that person is Native American, that kind of thing, right? And they're saying this commonly held view that race is a biological trait of human populations that is based in or visible from physical appearances, physical differences, is not scientifically grounded. What do they mean by that? Evidence from the analysis of genetics, for example, DNA, indicates that most physical variation, about 94%, lies within so-called racial groups. This means that there is greater variation within racial groups than between them. Throughout history, whenever different groups have come into contact, they have interbred. The continued sharing of genetic materials has maintained all of humankind as a single species. What does this mean? Anybody know what they're talking about here? Greater variation within racial groups than between them? Anybody? Oh, this. Yeah.
It means that if you were to take, say, two white people, the genetic differences between them would be, oh man, it's actually hard to say.
Okay.
Like, the difference between race isn't necessarily as big as people between the same group.
Okay. You take 3 people, and you look at them and you say, okay, well, these 2 people are white and this person is not. You say, okay, great, that's race. Well, if you actually look at their DNA, the genetic makeup of who they are, the 2 white people's DNA will be more different from each other than either one of them is from the DNA of the third person. Now, granted, DNA may not be the only way to think about race. But when you think about race in the context of the long sweep of human history across the world, and you think about the groupings that are associated with it or that are said to undergird it, right? The fact that we think of black people as having somehow come from Africa and that kind of thing. This is a fairly important way to think about it, right? Genetic makeup. This is the sort of code within which traits, whatever you wish to, both visible traits, your hair, your skin color, that kind of thing, but also invisible traits, susceptibility to disease, that kind of thing. This is the code in which that has been transferred down through the generations. What's this last part telling us? Yeah.
Divergent evolution hasn't occurred.
Okay. Divergent evolution has not occurred among humans. Which is, that's the correct way of sort of putting this in scholarly language. The more crass way to put it is, what? No, that's not very crass, is it? Throughout history, whenever different groups have come into contact, they have interbred. They have interbred sufficiently to maintain us as a single species, right? Now, there are parts of the world in which the idea that different races interbred, parts of the world at different times in history, the idea that people interbred across racial lines was extremely taboo and frowned upon in the most severe ways and was supposed to never happen. But the genetics, the DNA itself suggests, well, guess what, guys? It happened. It's happened everywhere. Now, these facts render any attempt to establish lines of division among biological populations both arbitrary and subjective. Physical variations in the human species have no meaning except the social ones that humans put on them. Now, this, again, is a point that's much more important to stress if you're reading Diamond than if you're reading Crosby. But reading Crosby, it's still there as a possible line of response or reaction to his argument. And these statements are perhaps a little controversial. I mean, do you agree? Physical variations in the human species have no meaning except the social ones that humans put on them. Race is not a biological phenomenon, not a biological category. That's what the Anthropological Association is saying. Do you buy it? Yeah.
In my geography class last semester, we read this article about how they were testing like a medication for heart disease, I think, and they found that it worked more effectively in African American patients than in Caucasian patients.
Okay.
But then they had to figure out whether that was like ancestry rather than like biological genetic component.
Okay. Okay, that's a very good example, and actually that's a very prominent example of the kind of thing that the Anthropological Association was actually concerned about, right? Medical research frequently tests for differences across racial categories, right? It's one of the variables they will build into study design. Whether it's the central focus or whether it's just another variable, background kind of variable that they collect. I mean, when they choose people to put in a clinical trial, they're concerned they might want to know their gender and their age, they might want to know their income, and they might just ask about race as well. Or it might be explicitly the focus. Like, let's see, does this drug work as well among African Americans as it does among whites or Hispanics or Asians, right? Now, that's an interest, because if they find that there is a significant difference, what do you do with that? How do you understand that? And the point that I think the anthropologists are trying to make here is be careful with that. It is possible that because of circumstances surrounding the longer-term conditions in which populations have lived and responded to, say, disease threats, things like that, that they will respond differently to certain kinds of drugs and certain kinds of germs, right? But to call, if you interpret that as a racial difference, you run some significant risks, right? So people whose ancestors lived in parts of West Africa are likely to have a different kind of response, statistically speaking, to certain kinds of diseases. Sickle cell anemia, malaria, that kind of thing. What the anthropologists are saying here is that that's not because they're African or African American or descended from Africans. It's not because of their race. It's because their ancestors happened to have lived in a place where malaria, for example, had a certain kind of epidemiological, virulence condition, that kind of thing. And this is this can be a tricky kind of point to quite thoroughly grab. The risk, of course, is that you might look at that study and conclude, oh, okay, therefore blacks are going to respond this way to this drug, whereas whites or other races aren't. When in fact, that's not the right conclusion. The right conclusion is people whose ancestors came from this part of West Africa will respond differently. People whose ancestors didn't, people who might be black but who didn't have ancestors there, will not. In other words, the explanation lies not in the racial category that's sort of put across the population of people in the study. It lies in the actual history and geography of groups of people who are not clearly demarcated by racial categories. Yeah?
So, with that, I've been struggling with the idea that ancestral ties provide, like, maybe, like, immunity against diseases so far removed from
Good question.
Plague was happened again, would they be immune to it now? Would less people die, or would it?
Good question. Good question. Through how many generations? Over how long do certain kinds of susceptibilities or resistances to certain diseases persist? Right? If your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents, had developed a resistance to a germ, plague, measles, whatever, is it still going to be in you today? And that's going to depend on a lot of factors, not only all of your other ancestors since that point in time, but also, how long does that kind of immunity or susceptibility persist in any given individual? Does it become a heritable trait? Is it a heritable trait to begin with or not? In other words, does it really reside in your DNA or does it reside in your immune system? And there are different temporal scales over which those levels of response change over time. Any other thoughts on this? It's funny, the anthropologists, when they brought this out, they didn't get anything like the kind of press that, like the Bell Curve, a book of about that same time got. A sociological study that purported to show that African Americans are worse students, are somehow less intelligent than white American students. And that book got all kinds of press, big controversy. This blue ribbon task force report from the Anthropological Association, despite having been the effort of a great many people over a great length of time, got almost no attention whatsoever. The message about what is the coherence or meaningfulness of any kind of racial category is an interesting and important one, I think. So, any other questions about that? No? Yes? Okay. So, I promise to come back and suggest that Crosby's argument is not tautological and that it's not a case of environmental determinism. And I want to talk a little bit about this. And the first one I want to talk about concerns winds and tides. Here's a map of the world depicting ocean currents. The red ones are warm, the blue ones are cold. My pointer still isn't working, I apologize. But you see, look at the North Atlantic. Now, I don't think we've actually gotten to this part in Crosby yet, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about it now. We haven't gotten to the part about tides yet, have we? And winds. Winds? Okay. All right. I apologize. What's going on here? Anybody? I need my pointer. Look at what direction are those currents going in the North Atlantic Ocean? Clockwise. And you see where the Canary Islands are there, just off the northwest coast of Africa? And you see where Portugal is, right? He makes this argument. He's like, why is it that these European mariners, these sailors and their sailboats, made it from Europe to North America when they did? Is this because they had some natural propensity to get in a boat and sail off into the horizon and never return, potentially? No, I mean, that would strike anybody as kind of preposterous, And he carefully reconstructs how this became technologically possible. And it has a lot to do with things that aren't technological at all. It has a lot to do with this pattern of tides and winds in the North Atlantic. He says, first, they figured out, they knew where the Canary Islands were. Those were well established. And they went to the Canary Islands and they set up a system of production using slaves. And this is also the Canaries and the Azores and the Madeira Islands all together were this sort of the first outpost of Portuguese colonialism. And he says this is kind of like a pilot. And the pilot then later became applied at this much vaster scale in the New World and also in parts of Asia. Well, how did they get there? He says they discovered they had to figure out how to get back to Portugal. It was easy to get from Portugal to the Canary Islands because, as you can see, the winds and the tides would carry you right there. But that makes it very hard to get back, right? Because the prevailing winds are actually in your face. How are you going to figure that out? Sailing is not something you can do straight into the wind, is it? Right? Yeah? I'm just trying to figure out if anybody's sailed and has an experience. How do you sail into the wind? No, nobody here? Yeah. You tack back and forth. You can go somewhat into the wind, but you can't go straight into the wind. So what they found out, though, was that if you went south with it, you would eventually get out of this predicament. You could make your way in this circle. And now I'm simplifying here. It might seem a little implausible at the scale of the Canary Islands. But what they discovered was this big clockwise pattern that would allow you to get back to Europe essentially by sailing directly away from it, which, again, seems like a kind of massive leap of faith. But it was a circumstance combined with certain technologies, advances in navigation, advances in sailing technology, that kind of thing, which made possible this discovery of the New World. And he's saying they sort of figured this out on a smaller scale first with respect to these islands off of Africa, and that discovery in turn enabled the discovery of much larger areas of the world, including the New World. And he also suggests that the same pattern in reverse assisted them in making it around Africa. You know, you can't go straight down the coast of Africa because the prevailing winds are in your face. But if you end up over here closer to South America, you can actually get into the currents that will carry you around the end of Africa. What's the nature of this kind of explanation? Is this environmental determinism? They discovered the New World because the tides and the currents and the winds were of a certain kind? Not really. Sort of. It was a condition of possibility. It made possible this expansion of Portuguese and later Spanish and English sailing ships, the range and where they could go. But it didn't cause it, right? It was just a circumstance that made it possible. And I want to suggest that this is essentially a case of eco-historical contingency. It is not an argument that reduces simply to environmental factors, even though those factors do play important roles. It's the combination of environmental factors with what we can only characterize as social factors. Social, technological, economic, political factors. Technological developments make certain things possible at some times and not at others. So there is, on the one hand, a great deal of attention being paid to environmental factors in this story. After all, this is called ecological imperialism. On the other hand, it remains also firmly grounded in the realm of history and contingency, the possibility that things happen in ways that are contingent on circumstances and not strictly determined by any one cause or factor or driver. And I want to suggest that this is also why the argument is not tautological, because he's not actually saying that the portmanteau biota, the plants and animals and diseases of Europe, necessarily resulted in the Neo-Europes and the domination of European descendants over certain parts of the world. It didn't have to happen, right? It was contingent on factors that were independent of the portmanteau biota themselves. Does that make sense? So, thinking about this in terms of this earlier discussion I offered about spatial and temporal scales and understanding the processes that come together at different scales, interact across those scales to produce outcomes, patterns that we can see in the world today. We can put them up here. These are taken from, well, these are very general categories, right? At very large scales, continents and millennia, even bigger than that. You know, the world as a whole, over hundreds of millions of years, we can think about tectonic drift. And that's a process that changes the distribution of land on Earth, right? It has effects on evolution by natural selection, which is operating, again, at very large scales, but smaller, significantly smaller than tectonic drift. Evolution by artificial selection is still more limited insofar as it's specific to groups of people at specific places. It's operating over thousands of years, but not hundreds of millions of years, at least not yet. Cultural modifications of the environment are at a slightly smaller scale. Human reproduction, on the other hand, happens down here at the scale of families or maybe tribes over a period of merely generations, right? Most of the decisions and actions that any individual takes, the decision, for instance, to get in a boat and sail across the Atlantic Ocean even though you don't know if it ever ends, that's a decision that individual people take at much smaller scales. And the question is, how do these different processes relate to each other? Can we really say that tectonic drift caused these sailors to get in their boats and disappear west into the ocean? Of course not. That wouldn't make any sense. But can we say that, in fact, tectonic drift had some kind of effect on the conditions that those sailors found and the circumstances in which they acted, and therefore had some kind of effect on the outcome of their actions? And there we can start to put together. I mean, that pattern of winds and tides is, in fact, strongly affected by the results of tectonic drift. Right? The distribution of the continents strongly determines what the ocean does in between them. It's also determined by other things that are even larger scale, but we wouldn't have those currents and tides in that pattern without those continents being where they are. So we start thinking about the specific pieces in Crosby's argument, and we can group them, in a sense, into bigger scale things and smaller scale things. And perhaps we can say that the bigger scale things, such as evolution, tectonic drift, the diffusion of innovations in organisms, perhaps we can say those things are strongly determined by environment or are themselves environmental in nature, right? Sort of beyond human control. Others are clearly very much human social phenomena. The contact of Columbus and other explorers with the peoples of the New World, advances in navigation. When you start thinking about diffusion of innovations, it's sort of in this gray area in between. And a great deal of the challenge of an argument like Crosby's is to figure out how to relate between these different scales, and therefore between phenomena that appear to have very different underlying causes and dynamics. Yeah? Would evolution by artificial selection be a human phenomenon? Yes, it can be. Clearly, it can be. Whether the original domestication of plants and animals belongs there is open to discussion, right? And this is something that both Crosby and Jared Diamond bring up. It's like, okay, once upon a time, somebody discovered wheat. But how exactly? Why? If you were a hunter-gatherer and you were accustomed to gathering roots, catching animals to eat, how would you even imagine that there could be such a thing as domesticated wheat? Right? How would you decide, how would you come to somehow plant the seeds of some of these wild grasses that grow around you without any input on your part, and somehow decide that, in fact, you should take the seeds off that grass and dig a little furrow in the ground and plant those seeds and then pull out all the other plants as they're growing up so that they don't compete, so that at the end you'll end up with wheat you grew? How would you know that that was going to make more sense than just letting the grass grow by itself and harvesting the wild seed heads, right? It's very, very difficult to ascribe intentionality to that discovery of domestication. I mean, Michael Pollan's made some interesting points about this with respect to corn. You know, is it that humans domesticated corn, or is it that corn domesticated humans? Right? You can make the same argument about dogs, right? Dogs, by most accounts, are the earliest domesticated animal. Did somebody actually wander around one day and say, oh, that wolf-like creature over there would make a really good pet, and then I could use it to herd I don't have any cows. Right? No. Very likely, the wolf-like creature started following the humans because there were reasons. There was food, for instance. There was extra food. And over time, you ended up with something that we call the dog, which it only really differs from the wolf-like creature in the fact that it behaves differently with respect to humans, right? From a genetic evolutionary point of view, it's very similar to the wolf-like creature. So again, it's a curious, is it really the result of some kind of conscious human act or not? Other questions? Is it really 10:23 already? 5-minute break. Okay, let's go ahead and get started again. No problem. All right, so now let's pick up the story. We're interested in the end of the Paleolithic, the end of the Stone Age. We're going to date this to about 13,000 years ago. The last ice age has largely retreated. At this point in time, humans occupy virtually all habitable terrestrial areas of the globe. They are equipped with fire, tools, language, and big brains. These are the tools they have everywhere, pretty much, as far as we know. And they are all hunter-gatherers. Diamond likens this to the beginning of the race, in the sense of there are all these people all around the world, and they're basically at the same starting line, as he calls it. And he then wants to know why people in certain parts of the world went faster than others, as if this all is some great big race. Anyway, 100,000 years ago, people had been limited roughly to this distribution. We're not sure about how much more of Africa and Asia, Eurasia, humans were found on. The question mark for Australia, I think, is actually somewhat misleading. I think we're fairly confident that there weren't people there at that point in time. 30,000 years ago, there were people in Australia and Oceania, and otherwise still basically restricted to Africa and Eurasia. 10,000 years ago, they were everywhere. Humans were across all of the habitable terrestrial areas of the globe, with pockets of higher density in the Middle East and parts of South and East Asia. So this is roughly the point in time that we're talking about. 5,000 years ago, there was great density of peoples, again, in the Middle East, along the Nile River, parts of South and East Asia, also now in Central America and the highlands of South America, and through much of what we think of as Western Europe. Here on the right, we have a table of overall global human population estimated across different points in time, beginning 40,000 years ago. We think there are about 1.5 million people. 10,000 years ago, there were about 10 million. Then you see this remarkable increase between 10,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, from 10 million to roughly 200 million. And that increase continues from there forward. And it's that period between 10,000 and 2,000 years ago, perhaps, that we're most interested in right now. We know that the end of the Paleolithic, which is marked by the discovery of agriculture and the invention of metal tools, dates to about 10,000 years ago in the Middle East. Other parts of the world, it's more recent. It's roughly 2,000 to 5,000 years ago. 500 years ago, we're up to 450 million people throughout the world, high densities in South Asia, East Asia, Western Europe, parts of other continents. Now, this revolution, this Neolithic revolution, occurred at different locations at different times. I've said this before. It happened sort of independently in different parts of the world at different times. 12,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago, defined by the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture as the basis of food provisioning. The earliest and most significant site was the Fertile Crescent, centered on the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what's now Iraq, right? Domestication and agriculture, grossly speaking, domestication is the process by which selected plant and animal species become dependent on humans for their reproduction. So This is actually putting it slightly differently from what we imagined earlier. It's not just, if you find a wild plant and you harvest a seed off of it and you put it in the ground and you cultivate it and it grows, have you domesticated that plant? No. The plant is not domesticated until it, in fact, needs humans to reproduce and persist. And that might be because the plant evolves over time under artificial selection such that it can't reproduce without certain human activities being practiced in relation to it. And we'll get into that with respect to wheat. It might be because it becomes a plant that needs humans to remove competition. Or in the case of animals, it might be because they actually become dependent upon us for food, right? Some dogs could maybe fend in the wild, hunting and so forth for themselves, but a lot of dogs, they couldn't do that. They might make it for a while, but they're unlikely to flourish as a species or a population without continued inputs of food from humans. Some plants like corn have gotten to the point where they can't even pollinate without our active intervention, right? Hybrids that their seeds are essentially sterile. They can't reproduce on their own. This dramatically increases food production per unit of land and work. And that's key, per unit of land and work. Generating a surplus, enabling larger populations, fixed settlements, more complex division of labor and political organization. These are the things that we associate with this revolution. The overkill hypothesis as I've said, is a key part of Crosby's argument. And I want to spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about what it is. It's also a key part of Diamond's argument, not surprisingly. But let's focus on Crosby. The question, why did so many large terrestrial animal species rapidly disappear from some continents, Australia, North and South America, but persist in others, Africa and Asia? Remember last time we talked about divergent evolution. We pointed out that there were mastodons. There were all kinds of fascinating, enormous creatures in North and South America roughly 15, 20,000 years ago. There were bison that weighed like 5,000 pounds or something like that. There were giant tree sloths that weighed 1,000 pounds. Wouldn't that be fun to run into a 1,000-pound tree sloth? And for some reason, most of these megafauna, these large mammals, died. Not just died, they went extinct in Australia, North and South America, Madagascar, a number of smaller islands. There were also large birds, incidentally, enormous birds. And they all went extinct, and then in other parts of the world, like Africa and Asia, they didn't. And this has been a sort of mystery for paleoecologists for a long time. And about 45 years ago, a man by the name of Paul Martin offered this hypothesis that people killed them. Or rather, the arrival of people in these continents resulted in the extinction of these megafauna. And at the time when he postulated this, the so-called Pleistocene overkill hypothesis, he was laughed out of the room. He was just unmitigated, derisive laughter because it seemed so preposterous. And he actually got in a lot of trouble with some advocates of Native American groups because it seemed to fly in the face of the idea that Native Americans lived in harmony with their environment. This argument was, no, in fact, the earliest American humans, in fact, totally disrupted this ecosystem. Or at least they wiped out huge numbers, entire families of species. And this was sort of politically incorrect. His thesis was that this resulted because these animals had not evolved in the presence of humans in these new lands, in these places, in Australia. So divergent evolution in places like the Americas and Australia took place in the absence of humans. Those tree sloths and mastodons had no experience, directly or via their ancestors, with humans. Whereas in Africa and Asia, they did. So over the course, looking back here at these maps, we're talking about between, say, here, actually going much further back, if you think about the ancestors of humans, the hominid ancestors of humans, there were mammals all over the place, but there were only hominids in these restricted areas. And as evolution proceeded down through the years, between here and here, humans arrived for the first time in the Americas and Australia. And these giant tree sloths and 5,000-pound bison look at these, probably 4 or 5 foot tall humans weighing, maybe 120 pounds? And if you're a 1,200-pound tree sloth hanging out in a tree and you see a 4.5 foot tall human walk up, what's your reaction? It's the same reaction giant tree sloths probably had to everything, which was giant tree sloths we call them sloths for a reason. They didn't move very much. They were really slow. They were just. If you're a mastodon, and you weigh, who knows, 10,000 pounds, and a 120-pound human walks up, maybe even like 10 of them walks up, what's your reaction? Yeah. I mean, whatever, you react however you feel like, right? I mean, basically, it's entirely up to you. They had no fear. They had no reason to fear. They had no experience with humans as predators. They had, in some cases, no experience of predators of any kind, right? These giant lions probably didn't have much to fear from much of anything. Or these 5,000-pound bison, that kind of thing. So they were probably very easy prey for humans with tools, with spears. Humans acting together, hunting as a team, that kind of thing. And part of what spurred Paul Martin's hypothesis was, in fact, the discovery of fossil remains of a mastodon in southeastern Arizona with a spear point wedged between its ribs. Unmistakable evidence of hunting by humans. Now, he put this together not just for the Americas, but for a lot of other parts of the world, and over and over and over and over again, you see the same pattern. This wave of extinctions of large mammals and birds in the immediate wake of the arrival of humans as best we can date it. Now, there may have been other factors as well as hunting. Hunting is why we call it overkill, but it's also possible that diseases contributed. It's also possible that there were other things going on, such as the end of the Ice Age, that may also have made conditions worse for these animals. But you have to remember, any kind of environmental change related to glacial and interglacial cycles would have been something that those animals had already been through many, many, many times before, evolutionarily speaking, right? Whether it's warming climate, decreasing precipitation, the disappearance of ice, changing patterns of vegetation, you name it. All those things had happened over and over and over and over and over again throughout the Pleistocene. And somehow those large mammals and birds had survived, had persisted anyway. So the arrival of humans looks like the most plausible explanation for the demise of these species. And Paul Martin's hypothesis, which was laughed out of the room in 1965, is now actually widely accepted as the best explanation we've got for these patterns. And this is what Crosby and Jared Diamond, for that matter, build on in constructing their argument about the portmanteau biota and the Neo-Europes. And I want to talk about why. So because large extinctions did not occur at the same time on different continents, nor with the same intensity, climate change alone seems to be an unlikely cause of such largely time-transgressive extinctions. I'm borrowing this from Geography 148. I just basically said that. Extinctions of Australian megafauna occurred 15 to 30,000 years ago, with 86.4% of the megafauna going extinct. The large-bodied mammal extinctions occurred between 10 and 12,000 years ago in North and South America, 73.3 and 79.6% respectively of megafauna becoming extinct. Africa, on the other hand, which is the site of human evolution and dispersal, experienced a 14.3% extinction of megafauna within the last 100,000 years. This sequence of extinction follows the spread of people from Africa into Australia, Eurasia, and North and South America. Paul Martin, Quaternary Extinctions, 1984. Crosby characterizes the earliest humans as shock troops for the Neo-Europeans. Now, this is perhaps the piece that we haven't gotten to yet. Why would that be the case? How could you make that kind of argument? What's the relationship between the earliest arrival of humans and then the subsequent arrival of the Neo-Europeans many thousands of years later? What difference could it possibly have made? This is a graph from another Paul Martin article giving you a sense of, as best we can reconstruct it, how long ago humans arrived at different parts of the Americas. And it's keyed to the local extinction of fauna in different parts of the Americas. There's still actually quite a bit of debate about exactly how long it took humans to get from the Bering Land Bridge to the tip of South America. And there's ongoing efforts to find sites down here that might be significantly older and cast doubt on this notion that they sort of expanded southward. But they did expand, as best we can understand it, very, very quickly, or it seems very quickly anyway, right? 11,500 years ago, they're up in northern Canada, and in 1,000 years, they make it to the southern tip of South America. I think Jared Diamond actually he's like, well, does that sound fast to you? And he's like, well, if you actually work it out, that means they had to move like 100 yards a day or something like that. It's not that remarkably fast. It just looks fast over those kinds of timescales. Here are some of the animals we're talking about. Outside of Macone, you can see the Smilodon, right? The saber-toothed cat. That's one of these megafauna that went extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, lions. All right. Now, I haven't quite put the last piece in place for you. And that is simply this. Why shock troops for the Neo-Europeans? The argument is that by wiping out large percentage, right, 70, 80, 85% of the large mammals, the large fauna of places like the Americas, well, in the old world, they persisted. This essentially deprived the descendants of those early arriving humans of the animal species, the raw material, so to speak, from which domesticated livestock could emerge later. Right? So in Europe and Asia and Africa, there were the ancestors of sheep, goats, cattle, horses, camels. The livestock that humans there domesticated and which they used to, for instance, increase their food production. In the Americas and Australia and other places, the overkill that followed on the heels of the first arrival of humans wiped out the large animals that the peoples there might then later subsequently have been able to domesticate and use for things like food production. So that's how this piece fits in. And when I mentioned last time, Crosby stresses livestock is the key distinction. If there's any single distinction, substantive important difference between what happened in Europe and Asia, or in southwestern Asia, and what happened in the New World, it has to do with livestock. And we haven't talked about all those implications yet, but this is why the Pleistocene overkill hypothesis is such an important part of things. Okay? Any questions? Yeah.
Why would big animals have prevented livestock and domestication from happening?
It's not that big animals would have prevented livestock and domestication. It's quite the opposite. It's that the large animals, granted, elephants are a partially domesticated species in parts of Asia, right? I don't think it's fair to say they're fully domesticated, but that's one example. That's a direct example. These don't look like the kinds of animals that would evolve into cows, do they? And you're right, they're not. Nonetheless, the point is that if you look at all of the percentage of species of animals that have been domesticated as against the whole realm of animal species is really small, right? And there are a variety of traits that you need to have in an animal, behavioral traits, reproductive traits, that kind of thing, that they all need to sort of fit together nicely to even make domestication a possibility, right? And the argument here is basically that if you don't have very many animals to work with in the first place, you have a much smaller chance of being able to domesticate any. And you look at what were the domesticated animals of North America prior to the arrival of Europeans? Anybody know? Yeah. Turkeys. Full stop. End of story. Dogs, dogs maybe as well. But dogs aren't really a food source, so they don't quite fit the same category. Right? Whereas you look at the suite of animals that were available, that were domesticated in Asia and Africa, and it's a long list, right? Pretty much all the animals that we think of as domesticated animals come from that part of the world. And the argument here is simply that had this overkill thing not happened, which is not anybody's fault, right? It's the fact that the animals there were not evolutionarily adapted to coexisting with humans. They hadn't co-evolved with humans. They didn't know how to persist in the face of humans. Humans, by the time they arrived, were a different kind of being from what they had been 100,000 years ago, right? They were suddenly equipped with tools that they hadn't had before, first and foremost. You look back, 500,000 years ago, they now had fire. They had bigger brains. There were a lot of ways in which humans were different from what any of the ancestors could possibly have experienced. Ancestors of these animals could possibly have experienced. And so it's you might call it dumb luck, right? Or it's a consequence of divergent evolution with this arrival of humans superimposed on it. And the long-term consequence of that is a depleted diversity of large animals that can be domesticated. Okay? Yeah. Still doesn't make sense?
Well, I think it does. So you're saying that it happened because since there weren't these animals to hunt anymore, you had to domesticate animals to start farming?
No, there's, how to put this? You can actually make if you look closely at the evolution of wheat and the domestication of wheat, you can see ways in which Southwest Asia was sort of had sort of better conditions in which to attempt to domesticate a grass species than were found elsewhere, right? It had a huge range, it had a huge diversity of plants that we now can see are related to wheat, and therefore you sort of had more to work with, right? Similarly with animals. That's the argument. It's simply that humans managed to domesticate a small fraction of the available range of animal species and plant species. And that range of available plant and animal species at least, was greater in places where humans and those animals had co-evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. And the reason for that is that in places where they hadn't, the arrival of humans precipitated the disappearance of 4/5 of the native faunal diversity. Okay. What goes in a bibliography? We've got about 10 minutes. I want to get this going in your minds. I want to get you thinking about the bibliography assignment. First of all, what goes in a bibliography? This depends on the context of publication, peer review, and audience. In other words, how many things you need, how many of the claims you make in your paper you need to substantiate with a reference to a source depends on who you're writing for and what you're writing. If you're writing a newspaper article, you probably don't need a lot of footnotes, right? If you're writing an academic article, you do need footnotes or references. Depending on the audience for that academic article, you might need lots of them or fewer of them, right? And it all depends on, how critical is it to substantiate the points you're making by reference to other authorities, right? Authoritative works of research. Typically, a bibliography is going to include the names of the authors, editors, and translators of the work, the date and place of publication, the title of the book, chapter, article, map, or what have you, the publisher or the journal name, and the page numbers. Sometimes you don't need the page numbers, but let's say that you do for our purposes. The idea is what? It's a pretty simple idea. You got to give them enough information that they can find it too. Whatever it is that you found, they should be able to go and look at. It's really not more complicated than that. It's sort of like, imagine that the person you're talking to or writing for is just a really persistent 5-year-old and is always saying, why? How do you know that? Right? You say such and such happened in 1537. Really? How? How do you know that? And you need to be able to say, well, if you don't believe me, go here. And you need to give them enough information that they'll get there. And you can assume for that purpose that it's not a 5-year-old and that they know how to find what you found. What does it look like? There are lots of possible formats depending on your discipline, the venue, conventions of different contexts, right? Your GSIs will recommend a format for your bibliography to you. It's important to be consistent and complete. It's more important to be consistent and complete than it is to follow any particular one format, okay? And again, your GSIs can give you examples of formats to follow. And this has to do with, like, do you put the initials of the author before the last name or after the last name? Do you put the date after the author or at the end? It's nonsense little details. But be consistent, be complete. Why are they important? For credibility, authority, and transparency. That's it. To contribute to the larger effort of building knowledge. If you want your reader to be able to participate fully in this collective process called science or the pursuit of knowledge, then you need to let them know where to go, because if it helped you learn something, maybe it'll help them learn something too. And for ethical integrity, to acknowledge the contributions of others fairly and accurately. It's really hard to come up with an idea that no one else has ever had. Right? Chances are good that virtually all your ideas will be ideas that somebody else has had. And that's not to say that you necessarily got them from those other people. Maybe you came up with the idea without relying on them. And that's great. But if you did rely on someone else, you owe it to them to acknowledge it and to attribute that idea to them, because that's where you got it. And the more research you do, the more likely you are to discover that your own ideas, in fact, have been thought by somebody else. And it increases your own authority and credibility if you know that. and can acknowledge it. If you can actually point to people who have had these ideas before, because what does that prove? That proves you've done your homework, right? It proves you know what other people have thought. What goes in an annotation? We're going to ask you not just to provide the source, name, and location, journal, that kind of thing for the items in your bibliography, but to write a short annotation for each one that you choose to use. And remember, you will probably look at a whole bunch of different sources, right? You may do searches and come up with a list of 50. You don't have to put all 50 in your bibliography. What we're asking you to do is work through those sources. Some of them you may just skim. You may just read the abstract. You may read the title and know that it's not what you need. But find the ones that are relevant and choose them to include in your bibliography and write an annotation. An annotation is information about the source in relation to specific research purposes. There's no need to write down, what does annotation means to make notes about, right? You don't need to make notes about everything in every source. You only need to note the things that matter to you for purposes at hand. So it's essentially taking notes as you read. And you're going to take notes about the things that are going to help you write your paper. This might include what the source says, what the information is, the quality or limitations of that information. You might write, it's based on a study that only looked at North America, but the pattern, the text might be relevant in other places, so it's important. What makes the source uniquely valuable? Is it original? Is it the original or oldest source of its kind? Is this the first person? Is this the Paul Martin for Pleistocene overkill? Or is it somebody else who just sort of repeated it later, right? Data, maps, figures, tables, illustrations, examples, or quotations that are particularly useful. What we're trying to get you to do is do the research, take the notes, such that by the time you're done with your annotated bibliography, you will have all the material you need sitting right in front of you, already noted, annotated, to write your paper. And the idea is that if you turn that in at the end of March, it'll be a cakewalk to write your paper. It'll already basically be sitting in front of you. We're going to ask you to put a minimum of 8 sources in your annotated bibliography, not including websites. That's not to say you can't find the source on the web. But if you find it on the web, we're asking you to find sources that were actually published independently of having simply been put on a website. You see what I'm saying? So Wikipedia does not count. You might go to Wikipedia, ask it, read what it has to say about a subject, and it might include a bunch of footnotes that refer to articles that are published. And those articles might end up being in your bibliography, and they will count as your 8, towards your 8, right? And you can have more. You can have 20, but at least 8 of them have to be of this kind. It should include the most important of the sources you found and examined, not all the sources you found and examined. It should include all the sources you need to write your paper, and the annotations only need to be about 1 paragraph long. So the actual finished product is not likely to be a huge document. It might reflect or represent a fairly significant amount of work working through a longer list of sources that don't end up in your bibliography. But the actual document itself is probably only going to be, 3 pages long, something like that. All right, I think that's it. On Tuesday, you'll watch a movie, and I'll see you a week from today.